The gallery buzzed with excitement as Huang Rong adjusted the final piece of her latest exhibit. The floor was scattered with a mix of polished concrete and soft, rich rugs. The walls, once bare, now vibrated with the interplay of light and shadow. The crowd was already beginning to trickle in, but Huang Rong couldn't help but feel a familiar rush of nerves. This was the culmination of weeks of painstaking work, weeks where she had pushed her own art into uncharted territory. She stepped back and gazed at the intricate installation she had spent so many late nights perfecting. Light danced along the walls in sharp, vibrant streaks, casting long shadows that twisted like snakes in the dimly lit room. The projections moved with such fluidity that it felt as if the gallery itself were breathing, pulsing in sync with her creativity. She tapped her fingers against her phone, making sure everything was set for the opening. Her assistant, May, hovered nearby, fiddling with the dimmer controls, ensuring the light levels were just right. Huang Rong was used to her assistant's jitters. May always felt the need to tweak things up to the last minute. "Don't worry, May," Huang Rong said with a laugh, her eyes scanning the room again. "I promise, it'll look perfect. This is the kind of art that makes people rethink what they know about the world." May, who was just about to adjust a projector, looked up, her expression tense. "Are you sure about this, Huang Rong? It's a lot. You've really gone all in with this May's idea. What if it gets too much?" Huang Rong cut her off with a smirk. "You know, May, sometimes art needs to push boundaries. I'm not going to be the photographer who just snaps a picture of a flower and calls it a day. I'm giving them something to experience, to feel." Just then, the door to the gallery swung open, and the first few guests trickled in, murmuring excitedly. Huang Rong shot a quick glance at the clock. It was time. As she turned back to her installation, she barely noticed May's cautious expression behind her. The room was filled with a soft hum, the sound of projectors whirring to life. Huang Rong had designed the light projections so that they would shift and change, sometimes weaving themselves into intricate patterns, other times pulling apart into jagged, chaotic shapes. She had even integrated some of her own photography into the projections, images of city streets, faces in the crowd, forgotten corners of Beijing that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, her guests oohed and ahed, caught in the hypnotic play of lights. Huang Rong watched with a quiet thrill, knowing that her work was making an impact. But deep inside, something felt off. It wasn't the installation, it was the way her own senses were reacting to the light, to the shadows. She stepped closer to one of the projections. The lights flickered for a split second, and her vision blurred. She shook her head, thinking it was just her eyes adjusting. But as she moved, the light seemed to follow her, a ripple of intensity that felt wrong, unnatural. She blinked rapidly. The hallway outside the exhibit looked strange too, like it was warping. "May," she called out, her voice suddenly sharp, "is the lighting set properly? There's something weird with the..." But May didn't answer. Huang Rong turned around, only to find the assistant frozen in place, eyes wide, staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. Before Huang Rong could ask what was going on, the gallery lights flickered again. This time, the effect was more pronounced. The light from the projections broke apart in jagged, shifting rays, casting strange shadows that seemed to breathe. Huang Rong's heart raced. What was happening? She reached up instinctively, her hand moving as if to adjust one of the projectors, but instead, her fingers cut through the light like a knife, sending it rippling. The effect was immediate. The projections around her twisted, multiplying, splitting into hundreds of glowing lines and angles. It was like standing inside a kaleidoscope. And then, just like that, she understood. She wasn't just adjusting the light. She was commanding it. The realization hit her like a surge of electricity. She moved her hand again, and the beams of light twisted in response. With a flick of her wrist, the shadows warped and bent. A maze of light began to materialize in front of her, filling the room. It was so sudden, so overwhelming, that for a moment, she thought it was just a trick of her mind, but it wasn't. the walls of the gallery began to fade as the maze expanded. No, she wasn't inside her exhibit anymore, she was trapped inside it. The light that had once been her tool was now something more, something alive, pushing back, swallowing her whole. "May," she called out, but her voice was lost in the rush of light and shadow. She spun around, disoriented. The light seemed to close in, walls of glowing filaments growing taller and denser. Shadows whispered in her ears, moving in ways they shouldn't. "This can't be real," Huang Rong thought. "It's just a malfunction." But as she tried to make her way out, she realized the truth: there was no way out. The maze of light and shadow was as real as the gallery had been. In fact, it was more real, like something that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary space. She had created this, or perhaps, it had created her. Her pulse quickened, and her breathing grew shallow. The light, her art, was now consuming her. And she was terrified. The sound of footsteps interrupted her spiraling panic. Someone was coming closer, and for a moment, Huang Rong thought it might be May. But when the figure emerged from the shifting light, it wasn't May. It was a man, dressed in a sharp black suit, his face obscured by the deep shadows that stretched unnaturally around him. Huang Rong tried to speak, to ask him where they were, but the words caught in her throat. The man didn't speak. Instead, he extended a hand. She recoiled instinctively, but the figure reached out again, and this time, something strange happened. The space around her seemed to pulse, as if the entire maze had drawn breath. For a moment, the light slowed, stilled, and she felt a strange tug in her chest, as if the man were pulling her closer. "No," she thought desperately. "I need to get out." But as she tried to move, the lights began to flicker again, quicker this time, the shadows shifting more erratically. The man's hand wavered just above her own, and for one terrifying second, she thought he was controlling the light. She was starting to lose control. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, but the words were swallowed by the twisting shadows. She tried to push forward, but the light spun around her like a cocoon, its threads tightening. She couldn't see the man anymore, couldn't even hear her own breath, just the hiss and hum of the lights, and then, the light exploded. Not in a burst, but in a collapse. It was as though the entire installation was folding in on itself, collapsing into the center. Huang Rong was pulled along with it, and in a heartbeat, she felt herself yanked through space and time, through 1,000 shifting realities. She blinked, disoriented. The world around her was dark, utterly, completely dark. She was no longer in the gallery, she was trapped inside the maze. The darkness surrounded Huang Rong, thick and oppressive, as if it were a living thing, consuming the space around her. She felt disoriented, suspended between reality and illusion, her thoughts swirling. Every instinct screamed for her to move, to escape, but there was no ground beneath her feet, no sense of direction. The maze she had created, the maze that had once been nothing more than light and shadow, had turned into something far more dangerous, far more real than she could have ever imagined. She took a step forward, or what she thought was a step, but the ground beneath her felt wrong, as though it shifted under her weight. Her breath caught in her chest. Her heart hammered like a drumbeat in her ears, and the eerie silence pressed in on her, suffocating. She reached out, her hands trembling, trying to make sense of her surroundings. There was nothing to grab onto, nothing to steady her. The maze of light, if she could even still call it that, was no longer made of clean, ordered beams and precise shadows. Now, it seemed to twist and bend, ever-changing, as though the very fabric of reality was unspooling around her. The walls felt soft, like they were made of fabric, but at the same time, they hummed with a kind of energy that was both alien and terrifying. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't panic. Panicking wouldn't help. She was the one who had created this. She was the one who had manipulated the light, shaping it into something unrecognizable. Now it had come for her, and she had no idea how to stop it. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she whipped her head around, heart racing. A shadow moved against the shifting walls, but when she focused on it, it vanished. Just like that. A moment ago, she had been the creator, the master of this world. Now, she was its prisoner, trapped in her own creation. "Hello?" she whispered into the void, but her voice sounded distant, swallowed by the oppressive silence. There was no answer. Just the soft hum of the lights, the quiet scrape of shadows as they shifted. A cold sweat clung to her skin as she took another step, then another. Her mind raced. She had to find a way out. There had to be a way out, but as she moved through the dark, the lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't just flicker, they bent. The shadows twisted in unnatural ways, as though they were pulling her in, urging her deeper into the labyrinth. She spun around, trying to find a point of escape, but the maze kept shifting, the walls closing in around her. She was no longer walking in a straight line. Every path she took seemed to loop back on itself, bringing her to the same spot over and over again, like she was walking in circles. A voice, low, almost a whisper, reached her ears, coming from the depths of the shadows. "You can't escape." Huang Rong froze, the words slicing through the silence like a blade. She wasn't alone. But who else was here? She scanned the shadows, trying to locate the source of the voice. But the deeper she looked into the darkness, the more it seemed to pull her in, like the shadows themselves were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. She couldn't give in to fear, not now. Not when she had no idea what was happening. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking to her, they wouldn't be able to control her. She would not let the maze control her. The voice came again, softer this time, as though it was inside her head. "You made this. You created it. And now it's yours to navigate, or be consumed by." The words made her skin crawl, and for the briefest moment, Huang Rong thought she might lose herself to the swirling madness of the maze. But then something inside her snapped. No. She was the one who controlled the light. She had built this place, this maze of illusions. If anyone could find a way out, it was her. A surge of determination flooded her veins, and she took another step forward, ignoring the whispers that swirled in her mind. Her hand shot out again, this time with purpose, her fingers moving through the air, shaping the light as if it were clay. She felt the energy surge beneath her fingertips, like the pulse of the universe itself, a force that could bend the fabric of reality to her will. She just needed to focus. She needed to reclaim control. The walls around her shimmered, the light shifting in response to her touch. She could feel the maze reacting to her, pushing back against her efforts. But she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything she had worked for. She pushed harder, shaping the light with more precision, commanding the shadows to retreat. She could hear the walls groan, as if they were protesting her defiance, but she didn't care. With every movement, the maze began to shift again. It was like the light was fighting her, battling against her will, but Huang Rong was determined to win. She had created this world, and she would be the one to escape it. For a moment, it felt as though the maze had stopped moving, as though she had won, and a sense of relief flooded through her. She had done it. She had regained control, but then, the ground beneath her feet buckled, and she stumbled forward, nearly losing her balance. The walls around her warped, bending in unnatural angles, twisting into sharp, jagged lines. The light flickered, throwing her into a disorienting spiral. The maze was fighting back again. "No," Huang Rong whispered to herself, her heart pounding. "I won't let it control me." She raised her hand once more, a surge of energy building inside her. This time, the light responded more fiercely, more powerfully than before. It bent to her will, responding to her anger, to her desperation. The walls creaked and groaned, but Huang Rong's focus was unshakable. She would not lose herself in this. She was the creator, and she would be the one to decide when the maze ended. The light twisted, expanding outward, pushing the walls back. She felt the maze begin to unravel, like a knot slowly coming undone. It wasn't just light anymore, it was reality, and she was pulling at its very threads. She could see the edges of the maze begin to blur, the shadows that once lurked in every corner slowly retreating into the darkness, but even as the maze unraveled around her, Huang Rong felt something else, a presence, something waiting at the edges of her consciousness, watching her every move. The voice from earlier echoed in her mind once again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. "You think you can escape?" it whispered. "You can't run from yourself." She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The voice wasn't just the maze. It wasn't just the light. It was something else. Something deeper. The very core of the illusion was shifting, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The walls of the maze pressed in on her again, tighter this time, suffocating her. The more she tried to control the light, the more it seemed to slip through her fingers. She wasn't in control anymore. The maze had stopped being a creation, it had become something living, something aware, and it was not going to let her go. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. What was happening? Had she been in control all along? Or had the maze always been in control of her? The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch out in every direction, curling around her like a cage. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the heavy weight of fear pressing down on her chest. "Help me," she whispered to the maze, her voice trembling. "Please. I just want to get out." The walls shuddered in response, and the light flickered again. For a moment, everything was still. But then, a new voice, one that sounded almost like her own, whispered from the shadows, "You've already made it." And then the light exploded. Not in a burst, but in a slow, suffocating collapse. The shadows swallowed her whole, pulling her deeper into the maze. The darkness enveloped her, tightening like a vice. The walls of the maze pulsed and shimmered, but Huang Rong couldn't tell whether the light was still under her control or if it had taken on a life of its own. Every movement she made only seemed to push the maze further out of reach, the shadows bending and twisting in impossible ways. The sound of her breathing was the only thing she could hear, a rhythmic gasping that echoed in the vast emptiness. Her fingers were trembling, and she clenched her fists, desperate to focus. Her voice, had whispered to her once more, and the words stung her ears like a cruel reminder. "You've already made it." But what did that even mean? She had fought so hard to gain control over this place, this twisted creation of light and shadow, only for it to unravel beneath her. The more she tried to escape, the deeper she was pulled into the labyrinth. Every step felt like sinking into quicksand, her feet dragging her backward into the darkness. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound didn't reach her. There was no release, no catharsis. Her voice was swallowed by the maze, consumed by the very thing she had created. It wasn't just the light anymore, it was the fabric of reality itself, warping, stretching, and pulling her apart at the seams. "I'm losing it," she thought. "I'm losing myself." For a moment, her vision blurred completely, and she staggered, hands outstretched, hoping to grasp onto something, anything, that would pull her back to reality. But instead, the shadows closed in around her, coiling like snakes, ready to strike. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A shape, moving through the maze, a figure silhouetted in the light, standing impossibly still amid the chaos. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice hoarse. She didn't expect an answer, but she couldn't help herself. The figure didn't move or respond, just stood there, like a statue, bathed in the swirling light. As she drew closer, the figure began to take form. It wasn't a person at all, at least not in the way she had expected. It was a reflection, her own reflection, but distorted, twisted, like something pulled from the darkest corners of her mind. The figure mirrored every movement she made, every hesitation, every breath, but with a cruel delay, like a dark echo that taunted her. "No," she whispered, taking a step back. "No, this can't be." The reflection stepped forward, mimicking her actions exactly, yet its eyes, those hollow, black eyes, stared into her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. The shadows around her seemed to grow thicker, colder, pressing in from all sides. It was like she was no longer looking at herself, but at something else, something darker, more twisted. "You created this," the reflection said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "And now it's yours. It's all yours, Huang Rong. You can't escape it." The words sent a chill through her, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. She was too far gone, trapped in her own mind, trapped in the very creation she had been so proud of. But there was something inside her, some last flicker of resistance, that pushed her forward. She couldn't give in to the shadows, not like this. "I'm not you," she said firmly, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I created you. I created this, and I can destroy it." The reflection tilted its head slightly, as if it were considering her words, then smiled, a wicked, knowing grin that sent ice racing down her spine. "You think you can destroy it? You can't destroy yourself, Huang Rong. You are this. You are the light, the shadow, the maze. You built it. You became it." Her pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. She had built this maze, yes. But she had also created it for a reason, to show the world the power of light, of illusion, of art. She had wanted to bend reality, to push the limits of what could be seen, to create something that made people question their very perceptions. She had wanted to control it. Now, she needed to destroy it. The maze wasn't just a prison, it was a reflection of her own psyche, her own desires, her obsessions. The more she tried to control it, the more it had consumed her. She had been so focused on her art, on creating the perfect illusion, that she had lost herself in it. She had built this reality, this labyrinth of light, but in doing so, she had built a cage for herself. Her reflection was right. She had become it, but now, she needed to break free. She closed her eyes and steadied herself. She could feel the pulse of the light around her, could hear the hum of the projections as they flickered and morphed. The maze was alive, it was breathing, and it was responding to her emotions, to her thoughts. If she could tap into that, if she could harness the raw energy of her own creation, maybe, just maybe, she could break free. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling, but this time, she felt the power surge through her. The light reacted instantly, twisting and folding as if it were answering her call. She didn't just manipulate it, she became it. She could feel it inside her, beneath her skin, weaving through her veins, every particle of her being vibrating with its intensity. But the maze fought back. The walls surged forward, the shadows stretched, threatening to swallow her whole. The reflection in front of her shifted again, its grin widening, its eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "You think you can control it?" it whispered. "You're already lost. You were always lost." "No," Huang Rong snapped, her voice low and fierce. "I'm not lost." She clenched her fists, and the light responded, bending, twisting, warping the very air around her. The walls cracked, splintered under the force of her will. The shadows recoiled, and for a brief moment, she felt the power of her own creation slipping away. The reflection's grin faltered, its eyes narrowing, as if it had underestimated her. "You can't escape," it repeated, but now there was doubt in its voice, an edge of fear. "Watch me," Huang Rong whispered. With one final, decisive movement, she stretched out her hands, and the light exploded in all directions. The maze collapsed inward, the shadows vanishing, the walls folding in on themselves like paper caught in a gust of wind. For a brief moment, everything was white, blindingly, overwhelmingly bright, and then, as quickly as it had come, it faded. She stood in the gallery again, the floor was solid beneath her feet. The walls, the light, the projections, they were all gone. The maze had disappeared, leaving nothing but the empty space of the gallery around her. She blinked, disoriented, as her eyes adjusted to the normal light. The air was still. Quiet. Had she escaped? For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do, where to go. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. She had fought the maze. She had fought the darkness inside her. But now, there was nothing but silence. Then, she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible hum. It was the light, the projections weren't gone after all. They were just waiting, and Huang Rong smiled. She had escaped the maze, but the light, her light, would never truly let her go. And maybe, just maybe, that was the way it was meant to be.